and welcome to Read Scholars Live. I'm your host, Dr. Mary Fleming, current president of Read Scholars, and I am so excited today to be with Wilfredo Gomez. We met a few months ago at the Read Scholars Health Equity Symposium, and he was gracious enough to agree to be on a podcast with me. And so we are going to learn a little bit more about his story today. So, hello, how are you?
I am doing well, thank you. Good energy to begin the day, a number of very fruitful conversations, and yeah, it's the good energy continues. Happy to be here with you. Thank you.
So excited. And you described yourself as a scholar and a
Mhm.
cultural critic. So we're going to dive into that a little bit more. But
Sure.
first, my first question to you. So we talked a little bit about music when we met and being a peruser of hip hop and hip hop culture is one of your things.
Yeah.
So today I was like, let's start with if you had to have if we were in person and you had a walk-in song, what would be your walk-in song today?
Yeah, this is a great question. I so appreciate the question. I also feel like it's a good get to know you question as well. I would say with the way that I've been feeling as of late, just the energy of the song, the instrumental coupled with the lyrics, I'm gonna go with Mobb Deep's Survival of the Fittest.
Okay. All right. Oh, you went hard in the paint. All right.
Got to give a head nod to New York City, and so um, I think that there's just something about the eeriness of the intro when the beat and the snare kick in, and just the way that Havoc and Prodigy play off one another. Um, it's just great hype music, right? And it's good intro music that seems fitting for the day.
I appreciate that. And, you know, some days, especially on weeks like this, we need something to hype us up and make sure that
Hmm.
we're ready for whatever battle we're going to face, right? Because we just don't know what we're waking up to these days, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It's
And that way, the opening line to the song seems apropos to the moment, right? The first verse of the song starts off with "There's a war going on outside, no man is safe from," right? And so, um, seems eerily fitting, in some ways for the moment for many of us, I think.
it does. And here we are. Here we are. Well, tell us, I like to introduce people, allow people to introduce themselves really, and share with your journey. So clearly, Read Scholars Live is about health equity broadly and how you got to the health equity space. And I think,
Hmm.
as we were talking, I mean, your journey doubles down on lots of things that can be very relevant for the health equity space. So why don't you share with us a little bit about your journey and and you can kind of lead it up to kind of how you got to the Read Scholars Health Equity Symposium, right? Because that's where we met.
Sure. So I'll try to be succinct but clear in this characterization. So I grew up in an immigrant community as a first gen Puerto Rican who was also disabled. I have cerebral palsy. So grew up in an immigrant community in New Jersey, and in some ways, had a unique journey from the outset in the sense that I was not mainstreamed into public school until a little later. So I was a student at what was then the Cerebral Palsy Center, and was then mainstreamed into public school and went through my entire K through 12 education classified as a special ed student. But I think apart from growing up in a community where I think people were of the world, but not necessarily in the world, when we
Mm,
think about some of those barriers and challenges, I was exposed very early on to the whole gamut of the Latino community. Also grew up with African Americans and some English speaking Caribbean folk. And so from a very early age, my understanding of questions of language, tonality, race, identity, diaspora, right? Even though I didn't necessarily have the tools, all of those things were there from an early age that I could pull from once I did acquire that toolkit. I think that one thing that was very special about that experience was that at some point, I also got plugged into disability camp, where I met, young people of color who had a wealth of disabilities across all spectrums, right? And that was also very formative for my upbringing. Um, I think for me, what those experiences really gave me were a set of tools to sort of really reflect on about questions of identity, belonging, citizenship, inclusion. And so I think when I got to college and university, I think some of those questions just naturally lent themselves to formal study in some ways. And so I've always kind of studied different disciplines from political science to English to education, all with the intention of really understanding systems of governance,
Mm.
really understanding how Black and Brown folk come to share space and borrow from one another in conscious and unconscious ways, and really thinking about what are the most effective ways to affect change, right? Either at the micro level or thinking about scaling that at the macro. And really thinking about what are the best avenues to sort of do that, right? Whether it's the nonprofit space, whether it's higher education. But I think a lot of those questions really stem from observations and conversations that I overheard adults having as a young person, but also just myself being in a room, watching my mother attempting to advocate for her son as best as possible and not necessarily having agency or a voice at the time. But I think that some of those experiences really frame how it is that I come to think about maybe some of the nexus between critical cultural studies and critical policy studies. And so I think in that way, that's how I arrive at this question of health equity and policy.
Well, you just dropped a whole lot on us real quick. Okay, so
That was a
let's
lot. I'm sorry.
no, no, it's all great. So let's dive a little deeper in a few of those things. So one,
Mhm.
starting from cerebral palsy. So I'm an OBGYN. There's going to be pediatricians in listening and others, but cerebral palsy is a spectrum, right? And so why don't you define it from your perspective so people really know what it is and how it um, how it is how it's defined as a disability, if you understand what my question is, right? Like,
Yeah, I would say that my understanding of cerebral palsy is that it is sort of a disorder of the nervous system that is in part due to brain damage in some capacity. My understanding, at least of jogging of my memory, is that there are nine different iterations of how disability can materialize from someone who is very, very high functioning to more severe manifestations. So I've had folks that I've known of, who were bedridden, who did not speak. Uh, and I think as much as I am a high functioning disabled person, I still think it's very noticeable when I walk that I have a disability. I have met folks with CP that you could not I couldn't, based on the eye test, you could not tell that they had a disability, let alone that cerebral palsy was something that would come to mind. And so, yeah, that's a little bit of how I understand CP. I by comparison am on the mild end of the CP spectrum. But I also think that I'm very grateful that, at least from what my mother has shared with me, that there were very early interventions of thinking about medicine and where physical, occupational, and speech therapy came into play. And so I think that that also was helpful in terms of helping my development.
thank you. I think that's helpful just to set the kind of ground level. And like I said, it's a spectrum, and it's usually something that is diagnosed at birth or shortly after. And like you said, there's many expressions, right? It just kind of
Hmm.
depends on what the level of injury is, if you will, and when that happens. So I think that's helpful. And then I think kind of diving into the next part of your comments and talking about identity. So I'll share another thing that which when we met, um, like I say, I'm a woman of a certain age, right? And so I was really hot that day, and so I had taken off my jacket, and most people probably on the podcast have seen my tattoos at some point, but I generally, when I'm speaking, don't have my tattoos out. And but I was so hot that day, I couldn't stay in my jacket. And
Mm.
so you
Where are you
expressed,
headed?
being
Where are
able
you
to,
headed?
and I was just myself at that moment, right, with no pretext, and thinking about identity in so many different ways, and I was nervous about it, and but you were like, "Oh, it was great to see." Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was really great. I felt like it was kind of like a radical intervention in the space, right? I think that so many times in academic spaces, I think we can sort of pay lip service to, welcoming all sorts of identities and understanding that there are different ways to embody the life of the mind and different ways of showing up. But I think it's also very easy to feel like that's not the case where when we're in these spaces, particularly when you're the only one, right? And so I think for me, it was in some ways a signifier of just the very vivid ways in which we can occupy space in a different way, right? That you can be an intellectual, you can be a scholar, you can think about health advocacy, you can do work in the community, but then think you can also show up in a way that is authentically yourself and be unapologetic about that. I was very appreciative of that as the only non-tattooed member of my family, because everyone has at least like seven and I have none. And my mom's always like, "You're an educated person. You're not supposed to, have tattoos." But what I do have is, I wear my earrings. I wear my gold chains around my neck. People don't usually see them. But that's sort of how I usually, show up in the world. And so if people catch me on a day where I'm just jeans, t-shirt, the chains are gonna be out and the rings are there, the earrings are there. Um, and I think it was just another layer of embodying my identity and saying, look, I don't think that it doesn't take away from what I do. It doesn't take away from my capacity to show up and do the work well. It doesn't take away from my commitment to community. This is just an authentic representation of who I am as a person, and I'm just going to own it,
Yeah.
right? Until you can show me otherwise, that it detracts from the other stuff, I'm gonna own it. And folk are gonna have to deal with it.
I love it. I love it. I mean, and I think, I mean, as an individual, I like to be able to create spaces where people can show up as their whole selves, right? Like, we can clearly be smart and intellectual and have a great time, but we can also bring the rest of us to the table, whether it's music or tattoos or, you know, movies or book, whatever, whatever it is, food, it's I think it's helpful when we can come and be our whole selves and have that safe space and let the conversation flow, if you will.
Absolutely.
Um,
I think in seeing, if I could say something about that
of course.
tattoos really quickly, it it not only made me feel like I could be in that space and feel comfortable, but I felt seen.
Mm,
Right? I think it was really great to be in that space and to feel like, I think that there's someone here who is also a kindred spirit, right? And it makes me think about some of the small ways that we make interventions that you don't even realize,
yeah,
right? And so I very much appreciated that.
yeah. Same. Like I said, I was like, and I was like, okay, it's all right. Like he was like, and if nothing else, we had that moment, and that that made my day, right? And so it was a good day. So I
Likewise.
appreciate I
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Thank you.
So going to the next part of your comments, thinking about language and immigrants right now, right? Like this
Mm,
is that's a
big
heavy
topic.
topic, right?
Big
And
topic. Yeah.
in the US in the fall of 2025. Um, Negotiating language in addition to like you said, being kind of isolated in a community in the US, but feeling like you weren't part of America, right? Dive into that a little bit more for me.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting. I think that I always say that I reflect on my undergrad years as my introduction and induction to America, right? And middle class America in a lot of ways. In terms of it being an environment where obviously I didn't see a critical mass of Black and brown folk. Um, I didn't see certain kinds of diversity in terms of um, values and identity and how people showed up in certain kind of spaces. And, we can talk about the ways in which people of color, code switch and code mesh and how they make sense of their realities. But I think for me, it kind of never dawned on me, right? That there were spaces in America that we, number one, that we were not in, but
Mm,
that we were not thriving, right? I saw people of color thriving as small business owners, innovators, teachers, law enforcement, local elected officials, right? Lawyers, medical doctors, right? And you had a broad cross spectrum of what that looked like in terms of how people occupied space. Um, and I think it never really dawned on me until I got to university that wasn't the norm, that people were not used to having that as a part of their modus operandi, right? And so we were kind of like put into a box. Um, and so I think that the experience growing up really gave me a unique window into thinking about generational differences, thinking about questions of race, ethnicity, diaspora. Um, and I think later on through my educational journey, it was something that I was able to sort of reflect on, give language to, and actually give some nuance to the story in ways that I would not have been able to. But yeah, I mean, I think that early exposure was one that not only do I continue to sort of lean on, but I think it also helped me as I lived abroad for some years. It helped me forge community and build bonds with other people because I was used to growing up with folks from different backgrounds and different cultural values, different preferences and tastes. I think what ends up happening, if I'm thinking about this particular moment and I'm being transparent, I still think that we we don't really have a sense of who Latinos are, right?
mm,
We don't really readily under we have this image in the sort of popular and public imagination, but it still is very misaligned with what the realities are on the ground. It doesn't account for how big the country is and the nuances of how these realities look like. Say, if we're comparing New York City to, maybe Latino communities in Georgia or Texas or Alabama, as opposed to like California, right? In terms of socialization processes and who you live around and how that influences your upbringing. But I think we have a very um not a good sense, not a strong sense of like the push and pull factors that contribute to different groups being here, how they are socialized, what kinds of communities they are residing in, how that impacts how they show up in the world, and what kind of relationships they've forged with one another, right? Because we don't all speak the same Spanish. If we do speak Spanish, because some of us are monolingual,
yeah.
right? English speakers or monolingual Spanish speakers, or speak some iteration of Spanglish, right? If we're thinking about subsequent generations. And so I think that we still haven't demystified, right? Who is a part of the community, how that is increasingly changing based on who we interact with and who we share space with, but also what are some of those push and pull factors that contribute to us being here.
You brought up several things for me there. One is, not each culture broadly is not a monolith, right? As we think about, clearly, as we think about America and not just regional, but state differences. And there's just so much nuance there. And, as we continue to gather data, which, first of all, we got to gather the data. Thankfully, we're a
Right.
little bit better than that,
Right.
doing better at that, I should say.
Yeah.
But now kind of diving into what that means and is, using a catch-all term, just like, we use, I filled out some form the other day and it was like Black or African. And I said, well, Like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
not just
Right.
one
Right.
group of people.
Right.
Those,
Right.
covers a gamut
Absolutely.
across continents
I
and
absolutely.
countries and like so many things. Like,
Absolutely.
um,
To your point, I remember some years ago hearing Juno Diaz give a keynote address at Brown University, and his challenge for thinking about diaspora was really interesting. And so he was like, you know, the challenge for us in these space, as you think about all the different ways that community can show up, is how do we think about the local to the international and the international back to the local, right? Because I think sometimes when I hear the word, blackness or black culture invoked, I'm like, are we talking about African Americans? Are we talking about Panamanian brothers and sisters? Are
right.
we are we talking about Dominicanos? Are we talking
Mhm.
about Puerto Ricans? Right? What about my homies from around the way who were both,
Yeah.
right? African American and Latino, right? And sort of like how a name can throw you into flux as an, oh, I didn't know that, because your name doesn't necessarily suggest, right, Latino ancestry, Latino lineage. But I think it's even unpacking some of those things. And so I remember like having a moment at a table one night, hanging out with some friends in the UK and talking to somebody from the continent, talking to somebody from the Bahamas. There was another brother from Jamaica. And I was like, look, like, it's really interesting to think about how the US and the UK don't neatly map onto one another. But my question to them was like, I think of you guys when I think about this question of diaspora. I'm sort of curious to know how many of you guys would think of me
Right.
when we think about this idea of the African diaspora, right? Because I think that some of my friends from Nigeria and Ghana were sort of really perplexed, like, why are you so comfortable eating the food that we eat for a living? And I said to them, well, the very simple answer, I should say, is that I grew up eating the exact same food,
The same, right? Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Rice, beans, plantains, all of it, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think it's a really fascinating conversation to be had, and one that still needs to be, I think, fleshed out with a little bit more nuance.
Absolutely. I was actually talking to a friend earlier today. And so I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. And my family and my grandmother's best friend's family grew up with the tradition of having hot tamales on New Year's Eve. And so I thought that's just what we did. I didn't think anything about it. And as I grew up, I was like, oh wait, this is not our thing. This is a whole cultural tradition. And I'm like, how did that get to us,
Right?
on this block in the West End of Louisville. And but it was something that we loved and held dear. And I'm still gonna try. I wish I could make them like my grandmother and my Aunt Catherine. But to your point, like all of these things are nuanced and intertwined, and we pass down traditions and we're all interconnected in a way that we, like I said, often don't even know, right? It wasn't something that
Yeah,
was explicit. It was just something that's what we did, right?
absolutely.
So and to your point, the more we interact with people from other places, then you realize, of course, we're more similar than we are different, right? There's so many
Hmm.
overlaps and interlaced complexities that we can go on and on about. But
Yeah,
um, let's talk about one more thing before I let you go because I don't
sure.
want to put you too long. So thinking about the future, right? So you have this wealth of experience, this lived experience. You have this robust academic and scholarly experience. What would you take that, and how do you inspire those who are coming behind you? What are you looking forward to? What is your aspiration for you know the young people now? Are I mean, it's a complex world. Like how do you keep
Hmm.
them
Hmm.
motivated? How do you keep them encouraged? How do you help them look forward to a positive future?
I think it's in some way I have been very fortunate in my life to have benefited from some phenomenal mentorship and folk who have poured into me with their wealth of knowledge experiences. I think in some ways it's both paying homage to those people, and attempting to put my own spin on that for younger folks coming up through the ranks, right? And so I think I always try to make myself readily available when I talk to young folks, like, hey, here's my email address, like, please feel free, any time of day, any way that I could be of help, a resource, an ally, please don't hesitate to reach out. Um, I think that I also try to uh put the responsibility on myself to meet people where they're at,
Hmm.
right? And so I think for me, doesn't matter what walk of life, whether or not you've had access to higher ed or not, right? I try to be very, very mindful of meeting folk where they're at and just try to be very present, do some active listening, and think about what kind of threads can be pulled, right? So sometimes that's talking to young people about, college access and equity stuff and identity issues and having that conversation. Sometimes it's getting into a really passionate debate about LeBron and Jordan, right? And where I stand on that, or who do you think the greatest rapper is of all time? Um, uh, or if you want to talk about the contemporary political landscape, right? I mean, I just had a really fascinating conversation last night, only because I met Mike Pence last night. Uh, and
Okay.
I had a really interesting, and my mom is not necessarily um as interested or invested in politics as, say, like my father is, but we had a really fascinating exchange, sort of just reflecting on that interaction, what was shared with the audience, and I got a chance to pick her brain a little bit about that, right? And so I think it's just um, you know, finding that entry point, and I think just communicating in a clear, effective way where you just let people know that you're valuing their humanity and all the wealth of capital and experience that they bring to the table. I think I have just as much to learn from anybody else as I hope someone has to learn from me. And I think we take it from there. But I think it's really just me attempting to do a 10% of what some of my mentors did for me. I think some of that is universal. And so, I think it's also like letting people know, as I had a conversation more recently with someone, like, shoot your shot, put yourself out there, right? You can, I've gotten a no from loads of applications and opportunities that I've applied into, but all you need is one person to say yes, right?
Right.
So, if you'll agree that you'll throw your hat in the ring, I will try my best to mentor, to read material, to give feedback, to do mock interviews, and I just try to do the very, very simple things that make people feel like they are valued and cherished for what they bring to the table.
Love that. Two things I'll pull out of there before we close, but one is the intergenerational conversations. I think they're so important. And as we talked about your America and how that evolved, and thinking about our parents' America, right?
Hmm.
My parents who were born here, your parents as they came here, and their parents before that. But also, that America is actively evolving, and so the kids who are coming behind us are going to have a different America, but it's important to have that conversation, right? Of how we evolve and how we have that conversation about what's different. And I think the other thing that's important is taking people where we are, or as they are. And we talk a lot about empathy and how that's important in the health equity conversation, and not making assumptions and just having a
Right.
conversation and going from there. I think those are great points to end on. And lastly, because we started different, we're gonna have to end different. And you brought
Okay.
this on yourself. So I will say, so my last question for you, because you just said this, who's the greatest rapper of all time?
Okay. So no, this is a good question. I've heard people make different claims about this. I'm gonna go with Nas.
Okay.
I'm gonna go with Nas as my greatest MC of all time. I could very easily make a case for Rakim or Black Thought. I think Black Thought is probably one of the most underrated MCs in the hip hop pantheon. But I'm gonna go with Nas in a lot of ways. Yeah,
Listen,
Nas is my GOAT MC.
I like it. You had no argument. I'm not, as I say, I'm not getting that fight. I love it. I love it so much. I appreciate this conversation. I mean, we went across the board and back. And so
Yes.
that is the beauty of these conversations and these interactions. And again, thank you for coming to our symposium and for introducing yourself and for agreeing to do this podcast. And as we talked about, for being seen and allowing me to feel seen as well. I absolutely appreciate that. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. I can't thank you enough. I can be a bit of a pain. I like people. I like talking to folks. So I thank you for being receptive to allowing some stranger to converse with you. But thank you so much for sharing this platform with me and getting a chance to share some thoughts.
Absolutely. No pain at all. And I look forward to staying in touch and
Yes.
seeing what the future brings us.
Likewise, likewise. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.